Trinity, we're currently in the midst of a sermon series on leadership. As I mentioned in a previous sermon, we sometimes think of leadership as being confined to politics or CEOs of big companies and corporations, but any of us can and should be looking for opportunities to lead because the world, the church, and the kingdom of God are in desperate need of good leaders. In my prior sermon, I defined leadership as a process of social influence in which a person can enlist the aid and support of others in the accomplishment of a common task. Now, let me remind us that influence is not the same as manipulation or coercion. Leadership isn't about getting other people to do what we want. An effective leader has identified a task so important that they recognize its achievement requires more than what they can accomplish on their own, all by themselves. Trinity, as a congregation, shares in a common task. It's our vision of growing in love and service through relationships with God and community. Now, that vision is carried out through a multitude of different ministries, things like Fusion, which will happen tomorrow night. It's our narrative experience and outreach. Our Sunday morning Trinity Connect, worship from anywhere, which is a way of people gathering in community online. Things like our caring ministry, our young adult outreach, even our governing board. So it's my hope through this sermon series to inspire more of us to become leaders, not only in our families, in our communities, at work and at school, but at Trinity. Since being a leader means then that we will enlist the aid and support of others to carry out what we've identified as that common task of growing in love and service through relationships with God and community. Now, in this sermon series, we've been focusing on characters from our Hebrew scriptures and the qualities of leadership that we see them reveal or exemplify. So this sermon is about Esther. And Esther reveals an important leadership trait of creativity. Creativity is needed for someone to be an effective leader. Now, Esther had to be creative because she was a woman living in a man's world. As I discussed during my sermon on Ruth, in this period of time in this part of the world, women were not so much people as they were property. They were viewed as objects. And so if a woman was going to exercise leadership, she was going to need to be very creative in order to step into that untraditional role for her. Now, before I get into the story of Esther, I do need to give just a little bit of historical background. If you heard the sermon preached last week by Pastor Monica, you would remember that it was about the anointing of King David. Under David, the 12 tribes of Israel became a strong, united, cohesive monarchy. But David's son, Solomon, so embitters his subjects that shortly after he dies, the kingdom splits apart. The northern tribes are later conquered by the nation of Assyria. But the southern tribes manage to hold on a bit longer, although eventually they are overrun and conquered by Babylon. As Babylon breaks through the walls of the city, destroys their temple, and then the Babylonians haul away into captivity, into exile, many of Jerusalem's brightest and best citizens. Now, no doubt, it was hard for the people to adjust to living in a different culture, but apparently some of them adjusted well to life in a foreign land. Later, Babylon was overrun by Persia. And whenever their king, Cyrus, issued an edict allowing all of the Jews to return to their homeland, there were Jews who just decided to remain in Babylon. And Esther was among them. Now, if you don't like history much and you've kind of checked out over these last few seconds, let me give you a really brief synopsis. At one point in history, Israel was its own independent, strong nation. But by the time of this story about Esther, Persia is the ruling power in this portion of the world, and the Jews have been dispersed to various countries throughout that part of the world. There was a large Jewish, what we call diaspora. And so our story begins. The king of Persia is named Ahasuerus. He's throwing this grand party for his officials and advisors, and as the party progresses and he becomes drunk, he sends for his queen, who is elsewhere entertaining the ladies in what I can only assume was a more proper ladies' fashion. Now, Queen Vashti, for a reason we're not given, she denies the king's request, his summons, and she refuses to appear before him. He becomes enraged and he consults with his advisors about what he should do. They remind him that insubordination in the palace will result in chaos throughout the empire. So, if men are to remain in control of their households, then Vashti needs to be properly punished, and she is. She's banished from the empire. And an edict is issued, a royal decree throughout the land that each man should be master of his own domain. Scene 2. Some time passes and the king has become, well, shall we say, lonely? Some new advisors suggest that he summon all the virgins throughout his empire. They're to be brought to the palace where they will spend an entire year undergoing a regimen of beauty treatments. Then, one by one, they will each spend one night with the king, and whichever virgin pleases him the most will become the new queen. I hope you can see by this point in the story why I say that in this point of history, women were not treated as people, they were treated like property. And if they were to function as leaders, they were going to need to be very creative. Now, among the young ladies summoned to the palace is Esther. Esther's parents died when she was young, and she was raised by an older cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai is already employed within the palace, and for a reason that we don't get, apparently people recognize that Mordecai is Jewish, but they're not aware that Esther is Jewish. Now, Esther is apparently very beautiful, and upon her arrival at the palace, the king's assistant immediately begins to favor her. He gives her the best food, the best cosmetic treatments, and when it comes time for Esther to, well, shall we say, audition for the king, he is very pleased with her. And she becomes the new queen of Persia. Next scene. Now the story focuses on Esther's cousin Mordecai, and we learn that he is a faithful servant of the king, and that on one occasion he uncovered a palace coup. He reported the impending assassination plot to the king via his cousin Esther. And although the king is grateful, he fails to reward Mordecai for his loyalty, and that is a detail that will become very important as the story unfolds. Now, second in command to the king, his number 2, is a man named Haman. Haman thinks quite a lot of himself. But Mordecai, not so much. Other palace officials bow before Haman, but Mordecai refuses to do so. And this makes Haman really angry. It drives him mad with rage. And in his rage, he makes a rash decision. Since he knows that Mordecai is a Jew, he decides that he will respond to his insubordination by exterminating the entire Jewish population. This is overkill. Not only figuratively, but literally. Now, this, of course, he cannot do without the king's approval, so Haman approaches the king dishing out half-truths designed to appeal to the king's ego and incite fearful self-preservation. He tells the king that these Jewish people, they're different, and they have different laws, and they separate themselves from the other citizens, and they disregard the king. Now, certainly, the Jewish people were different, and they did have distinctive laws that God had given them on Mount Sinai, but they've been living peaceably among these people for quite some time now, and one of them, Mordecai, has even demonstrated this remarkable loyalty to the king. Nevertheless, Haman's speech, along with a rather large bribe, secures the king's approval for a day of slaughter. Haman is allowed to send out a decree throughout the empire that on the 13th day of the month of Adar, it will be open season on the Jewish people, and anyone who would like to may slaughter them, even their women and children. When the decree is posted, Mordecai is devastated. He sits in sackcloth and ashes outside the palace gate, weeping and fasting. Now, word of his behavior reaches Esther, who apparently at this point doesn't know anything about this decree. And she summons a servant. She sends them to go and find out what's going on with Mordecai. And he relays a message back to her via the servant that she had better do something about this. But Esther is in a quandary because not even the queen is allowed to approach the king unsummoned. Or in other words, she can't initiate her approach of the king. I mean, how is she going to do anything? Still, her cousin Mordecai's words compel her to act. He says to her, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." There is a task before Esther that involves a life or death choice. And she is inspired to find a way to creatively step into a leadership role in order to save her people. That's her task. Will she be courageous and creative enough to find a way to influence the king to come to her aid and support her in this task of saving her people? Did you notice what I did there? I wove the definition of leadership into that last paragraph. So Queen Esther must take the ultimate risk to approach the king unsummoned, a transgression that is punishable by death. Well, thankfully, the king gladly receives her into his presence. And such a bold move, he assumes, means that she has a request to make of him. And so he invites her to make her request known. But Esther, remember, she's creative. She doesn't tip her hand too quickly. Esther's initial request is that she be allowed to prepare a dinner for the king and Haman. And meanwhile, Haman continues to be incensed by Mordecai's failure even now to bow to him. And so at his wife's suggestion, Haman erects a gallows on which Mordecai the Jew shall be put to death on the 13th day of the month of Adar. Now we are brought to another scene. It is night time, and the king is suffering from insomnia. Wide awake in the middle of the night, he summons his servants to bring him books containing the royal archives. If that wouldn't put you to sleep, I don't know what would. But the king is awake all night, reading them until dawn, when he comes across this story of Mordecai, who foiled a plot to assassinate him. So King Ahasuerus notices that there's no record of Mordecai ever having received a reward for this good deed. Now, about this time, Haman shows up for work. The king summons him and asks this question: "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Now, remember what I told you. Haman thinks quite a lot of himself. He thinks that the king is talking about him. And so he suggests that the man whom the king wishes to honor should be dressed in royal garments and paraded through the city streets on a royal steed. Imagine how furious Haman is when he is instructed to do just that for his arch enemy Mordecai. Haman returns home in disgust, and shortly thereafter is summoned to this royal feast with the king and queen. And as they dine, Esther finally makes her true request known. She wonders if the king might spare her people whose extermination is about to come to pass. Now, the king, in his usual thick-headed fashion, seems clueless as to how this happened. Esther points the finger at his right-hand man, Haman. Haman is seized with fear. The king, angry and frustrated, decides to take a walk around the palace to clear his head. Meanwhile, Haman, utterly terrified and distraught, throws himself at Esther's feet to beg for mercy, beg for his life. When the king returns, he sees Haman throwing himself at Esther and assumes that he has added insult to injury by making a pass at the queen. Enraged, the king, under suggestion by a eunuch, has Haman put to death on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. And that, my friends, is the conclusion of this remarkable story. Now, there's a curious thing about the book of Esther. Within the book, God's name never appears, not a single time. And yet, the fact that God's name is absent from the book does not mean that God is absent. For it appears that God has set the stage perfectly at each step along the way so that his chosen people will be preserved and protected, including raising up for them a very unlikely leader in this young woman named Esther. As readers, we observe her inward struggle in response to her cousin's challenge. Who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Who knows? Esther must determine where God is leading her, a powerless young foreign girl in a man's world. She must discern a way to creatively take the lead, to not simply sit on the sidelines and wait to see how things unfold, but to become a leader and an influencer, determined to fulfill the task of saving her people. At the end of the day, she need really only influence one person to join her. But the response of that one person, the king, presents a life or death risk for her. She is courageous for sure and clever, but in order to succeed, she must also be creative. Over the years, church growth consultants have referred to what they call the church's 7 deadly words. We've never done it that way before. We've never done it that way before. As Christians, we are often reluctant to be creative and bold and take risk, to think outside the box. Who knows if a new way of doing something really stands any chance of success when it's new, it's not been tried before. One definition of creativity is the phenomenon whereby something new and valuable is formed. Creativity adds value. Without creativity, we will simply do the same thing, expecting a different result. I remember years ago attending a workshop by church growth guru Lyle Schaller, in which he shared a story about a church in the early days of indoor plumbing. At a congregational meeting, a woman stood up to recommend they consider replacing the church's outhouse with an indoor water closet. Several members murmured their support of her suggestion, even though water closets weren't really common in churches at that point in time. But then an influential member stood up and said, "We all know what people do in an outhouse. Do we really want people doing that in the Lord's house?" And with that one naysayer, members of that church were resigned to the outhouse for decades. Friends, have you ever thought about the fact that God's first demonstrated attribute in our Bible is creativity? Our Bible begins with the story of creation, God's first demonstrated attribute. And we're told within that story that we are made in God's image. And so if we are to be leaders, we must ask ourselves, are we willing to probe, to dig deep into our God-given creative energy so that we might influence others in developing new and valuable ways to carry out our task, God's purposes and Trinity's vision?